Hello, welcome back to Mining Network. I'm with Dr. Duncan Money, the author of Born with a Copper Spoon. Duncan, good to see you.
Oh, well, thanks for going to have me on.
Obviously, Born with a Copper Spoon. We're obviously having a conversation about copper today. Let's just kick things off. Maybe we could just go into a little bit about who you are, your learned history, and then maybe a bit about this book that you've just released, and then we'll move on to an actual conversation around copper.
Yeah, so I've looked at the history of the mining industry now for about 10 years. So I wrote my PhD about the history of the copper belt, which I'm sure a lot of people listening to this know is this kind of heavily industrialized area running along the border of northern Zambia and DR Congo.
Yep.
And so I have a long-standing interest in the topic. I also lived for a few years and worked in South Africa. So historically one of the world's largest mineral producers. And so, yeah, I continued to kind of research and write on the mining industry since then about histories of work, histories of management, looking into the kind of companies and trying, yeah, to move over that time from looking at Southern Africa to taking a more broader perspective on the industry. And that's really where the book, Born with a Copper Spoon, comes in. So I was a part of a team of contributors taking case studies from all around the world. And we try, the book is billed as a global history of copper, and we try and live up to that. So we've got stuff from Latin America, North America, Southern Africa, Middle East, East Asia, Australia, and Europe.
I think one of the key things why this is important is obviously we're in this, I'd say, fairly turbulent time with copper at the moment, or at least if you read the headlines, you'd believe that we are. Even more recently, we're seeing that stockpiles are at the lowest they've ever been, and you sort of hear this every couple of years, where even though copper traditionally sort of tracks along GDP, there's always been this outcry of we're never going to have enough, or we're running out quickly, but this isn't new, is it? I mean, this has happened quite a lot in the past.
Yeah, no, certainly not. Again, many people listening to this will be aware that copper is a cyclical industry, subject to some booms and some pretty spectacular busts over the last century and a half. And I think you can look at in that time some long-term trends in the industry, and one of them is this kind of recurring fear that we're going to run out of copper. Ever since copper becomes this crucial metal for industrialization, I'd say 1870s, people worry every few years that we're going to hit a kind of geological limit on the amount of stuff we can get out of the ground. And well, so far we haven't. This Yeah, copper production has increased at a fairly steady pace for well over a century. Obviously, dips now and again, but look, generally, what people referred to in the past as the coming copper famine has not come about.
Do you think things are different now, or I mean, fundamentally, obviously, we see this electrification and sort of more electric vehicles, more renewable power. A lot of it needs a lot more copper. The re-electrification of the grid, especially in the United States, 4 trillion going into electrification. I mean, is there a fundamental change here from anything that we've seen in the past?
I don't think so. Look, the copper has been integral to infrastructure before. Lots of, and in the beginning of the 20th century and then the interwar period, lots of countries created national electricity grids. The United States built coast-to-coast networks. This required huge quantities of copper, much more than had been needed in the past. I think there's a good analogy between these kind of worries that large-scale infrastructure projects would uh, produce this kind of copper famine 120 years ago, 100 years ago, and these same worries today. Uh, as in the past, these things were solved.
Okay. And what about, I guess, in the what we have seen throughout the last, well, ever since we can remember mining copper, I guess, is this continuation of grade decline, right,
Mm.
in copper mines. So, we started off at very high grade, sort of native copper, and then we've went down to high grade VMS style, I guess, and then we're now into porphyry, very low grade copper, large deposits. But I guess even though the grade has been decreasing, production's sort of kept up. One of the worries that a lot of people are writing and reading about at the moment is that a lot of the largest mines out there in the world at the moment, such as the ones in Chile and Indonesia, are now sort of, they're reducing their cut-off grade. So essentially, they're going to be needing to produce more tonnage for the amount of copper that of waste. Sorry, they'll essentially be creating more waste per ton of copper that they produce. So, um, does that change anything in your view in terms of these grades declining?
Sometimes I get accused of saying there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to the historical perspective, but I do think that in this instance, you're absolutely right. There is this kind of long-term decline in the grade of copper deposits that can be extracted profitably, but these are technological problems that have been overcome in the past. In the 1900s, there was this big fear of the copper famine in the United States. That I think between 1900 and 1906, U.S. copper production went up by 70%, but consumption went up by 92%,
Wow.
more or less. And then in 1907, production fell, and this caused well, a lot of worries. The New York Times printed a headline saying the metal markets were empty and that copper prices were going to go through the roof. What actually happened there was the development then of a completely new kind of mining. People started open pit mining, which was totally different to what had gone before. So there were these worries that the high grade underground copper mines in places like Butte, Montana, Michigan, Arizona, they couldn't produce fast enough to keep up with demand, and that they'd only been able to keep up with demand because they'd kept finding these new big deposits in the United States, also in Latin America, and around the world, and suddenly there were no new prospects on the horizon. Instead, in Utah, Daniel Jackling managed to exploit what was at the time considered a ludicrously low-grade copper deposit. The rate of recoverable copper went from about 10% in Arizona to 2% in Utah. I think in some ways he didn't so much find a mine as create a mine.
Be a pretty good grade today, wouldn't it? 2%?
Yeah, true. But yeah, look, if you could suddenly mine something that's a tenth of the grade that you're mining at the moment, and do so and make money while doing so.
Well, you were mentioning earlier that back in the 1920s, pre-war, there was a big investment into nationalizing the grid in the US, sort of coast to coast, east to west. Do you see that as obviously when you're baking inflation and everything else, do you see that as just as large of an infrastructure project as what we're sort of seeing here at the moment with electric vehicles and renewable power and baking into more of the grid?
Look, I don't have the figures to hand, but if I was to take a rough guess, certainly I would say these are people. If you look at the proportion of the world who had electricity in kind of 1890 and the proportion who had electricity in 1930, there's an enormous difference. Places, yeah, all around the world got well, not just lighting, but also electrified transport, because the tram networks in many cities, of course, off the grid.
So I guess the way really around this is new technology needs to come forward and really make lower and lower grade copper mines economically viable. Is that, and
Yeah.
then, and is that something that you, obviously we've seen it happen in the past. I guess it's not too absurd to think that can continue happening.
Yeah, I think those kind of long-term trends can be expected to continue. But more than that, there's also a lot of these problems in the past have been solved in ways that people just had no idea would happen. Lots of investors thought open pit mining was crazy. It would never work. Kind of trying to mine those kind of tonnages to produce copper, and very quickly it was how most of the world's copper was produced. People's kind of perception and image of what the copper industry looked like changed a lot. If you're an engineer, if you were a copper mining engineer in 1890 and you're presented with a large open pit, that's not a copper mine. Copper mines are underground, extracting native copper or high grade stuff. It's not, you don't dig a big hole in the ground.
What's your view? Because obviously you've with this book you've done a lot of research in the history of mining throughout the world, specifically for copper. But are there any areas where previously there were quite high grade copper deposits? Obviously, you don't need to list where exactly, but as in, are there jurisdictions now that have the potential to emerge as large copper producers based on historic? So there's things like places in the Middle East or places in Asia that potentially aren't actually in production or doing things at the moment that could help fill that gap, do you think?
That's a good question. Look, lots of what are now considered marginal producers or mines that shuttered in the big copper collapse of the 1970s. Well, there's still metal in the ground there, or in old mining dumps that were processed in the 50s or 60s. A lot of this in southern Africa. I'm sure as well in Chile and Peru. There are old mines that could conceivably be brought back into production.
Okay, and Doug, for those interested in your work, where can I actually go and find the book Born with a Copper Spoon and more information on this?
So the book's available from our publisher, the University of British Columbia Press. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's only in hardback, which is outrageously priced. But good news, a paperback will be out this year at a much more affordable cost.
Brilliant, Duncan, thank you.